Good evening, everyone. First of all, thanks for joining us for the 2019 drone webinar. My name is Travis Balthazar, and I'll be guiding you through tonight's events. If you tuned in last year, this will be very familiar. You'll see some highlights on some differences that have changed over the last year, but in most part, it would be the same compared to last year, but those differences are highlighted here. So please stay tuned if you are a repeat for this year. A little bit about myself. Again, my name is Travis Balthazar. I do have a bachelor's in aviation technology, which is a manned aviation background. So I started my degree path right here in Salina at K-State Polytechnic, flying manned aircraft and obtaining a degree through that program. To add to that, I got a minor in aviation safety, and I'm currently working on a master's in human factors for unmanned aircraft systems. For about 8 years now, I've been a certified flight instructor and still hold that rating today. Back when I first got involved in unmanned aircraft systems, I was initially brought on to the Applied Aviation Research Center within K-State as the UAS chief pilot. I held that position for about 2 years. And then for about the last 3 years, I've been in the U.S. Flight Operations Manager's position. So some things here, I do have a couple other people with me tonight. They'll be monitoring the question and answer forum. So feel free to go ahead, and it looks like several of you have already put in some good questions, and we'll be addressing those one of two ways. One way will be one of these two individuals next to me will be responding to you directly through the messenger, or if it's a really good question, we'll actually post it up during the question and answer part of this forum. So to operate that question and answer component, we're going to show you initially how to go through that. I got some slides to show you how to actually pull up those dialogues and go through them. As far as the whole overview, we are going to cover some terminology, some basics. So again, this is an entry-level webinar here. So those that are just wanting to get into unmanned aircraft systems, this will help you out as far as just starting from ground level. We'll cover some UAS background as far as K-State's concerned, and then we'll jump into why we're all here to talk about the hobbyist regulations for unmanned aircraft and the commercial regulations for unmanned aircraft. And then at the end of this, again, we'll cover a lot of the question and answers that you guys come up with as we go through here. So how do you set up, or how do you ask a question rather? If you look for the Q&A button, and I have it circled here for you, depending on your browser, this may appear in a couple different places, but just look for that Q&A button. Once you click on it, you should get a dialog box. This may be at the bottom, or it may populate separately. But within there, you can ask your question, and that'll come to one of my colleagues here who will either respond to it directly or put it up on a message board for me to view during the question and answer portion. So let's go ahead and give it a try, just so everybody's familiar with how the system works and can actually get some functionality out of it. So what we're going to do is force a poll, and what we're going to initially do is just a little teaser here is just, do you currently own a drone, yes or no? And so one of my colleagues right now is going to push out a survey for all of you to answer, and you can start polling your answers into that. All right, so we're going to post the results here. So do you currently own a drone? Looks like 60% of you say yes, roughly 40% of you say no. So we have a pretty good distribution across the participants tonight. So that's a good functionality test to make sure that all of our systems are working here. And there'll be several polling questions coming up shortly to where you can participate and get involved in this webinar. So a few terminology components here. So some abbreviations. If any of you have been in aviation very long, You know that acronyms are everywhere within aviation, so I'll do my best tonight to make sure that I use the full name rather than the acronym. But in case I do abbreviate some stuff, I have some of the most popular ones that we'll be covering tonight. So at the very top, Kansas State University, KSU, Unmanned Aircraft Systems, short is UAS, Federal Aviation Administration, FAA, National Airspace System, NAS, or NAS, RPIC, Remote Pilot Command, Ground Station, GS, Section 333s, and I'm sorry, Section 336, and then 14 CFR Part 107, which refers to the commercial UAS regulations. And if I mess up and I say something that is an acronym and you don't know what it is, certainly just get on there and ask a question real quick, and one of these guys can get back to you real fast on that. So why do we say UAS and not drone? Over the years, especially now coming into 2019, we've noticed a trend that drone is a very popular term, but by the FAA, or Federal Aviation Administration's viewpoint, it's not the right term. The right term is unmanned aircraft systems, and that is because aircraft are what they regulate. So when it comes to regulating aircraft, from their perspective, they really see no difference between manned and unmanned because they are defined as aircraft, which allows them to have some leverage over how they regulate these unmanned aircraft systems. So you may hear both, just know that they're one and the same, but as far as the federal regulations are concerned, unmanned aircraft systems is the correct terminology. So a little bit of history of K-State. I won't go through all of these here, but for over 10 years now, we've been involved in unmanned aircraft systems. Starting with a Greensburg tornado that happened here in Kansas. It was an F5 tornado that pretty much wiped out the town. At that time, the state of Kansas National Guard and several of the assets were deployed overseas. So the response to that major event was not quite on par with what it should have been. At that point, the state of Kansas realized that we needed to look at alternative ways of responding to major natural disaster events across the state. And so our program was founded shortly after that to have as a beginning a natural disaster response unit, and we still hold that today. So we're on call for any national disaster, whether it's local here in Kansas or across the United States. As we go through the years here, the next big thing is when we start offering a bachelor's degree in aviation technology, which is essentially preparing pilots, U.S. pilots, to go out into industry. It is a 4-year degree, and we have several degree options now for those interested in a degree within unmanned aircraft systems. 2015 was one of the growing years, and as you can see, 2015 through 2018, we really expanded our operations and what we do. But back in 2015, again, this is a long time before the regulations ever came about. So back then, we were operating under a public entity, and we still have several operations that involve that type of regulatory environment. But for the most part, these days we do operate under Part 107, which happened within the 2016 year. Shortly after those regulations were released, we started offering a number of courses available to the public. Those include a Part 107 commercial certificate, which we'll talk about later on within this webinar. And basically just prepares those that want to operate unmanned aircraft systems commercially to get their license, their Federal Aviation Administration license, to go out and do those operations. In 2017, we also became a member of the Pan Pacific Test Range Complex, which is a partner with the FAA to conduct aeronautical research for unmanned aircraft systems. And then in 2018, just last year, we expanded one of our course offerings to include law enforcement flight training for those law enforcement agencies that want to involve unmanned aircraft within their day-to-day. So, you think about search and rescue, you think about natural disaster response, fugitives, crime scene reconstruction. Through that course, we actually teach them how to conduct all those operations utilizing an unmanned aircraft system. And we've had several different training programs over the last 6 or 7 months now, to where we've had law enforcement agencies out and go through that program. And the last bullet down there at the bottom under 2018, in 2018, we're also selected as a core partner for the Kansas Department of Transportation, which was awarded as one of the few Kansas IP integration pilot program awardees. So through that program, it was initiated by the president to basically come out with the next set of regulations for unmanned aircraft. And so we're helping Kansas Department of Transportation and the FAA in general come up with the next set of regulations and policies and procedures that will be rolled out for the next big phase of UAS operations. So ops over people, beyond line of sight, and those operations that are currently restricted today. So a couple knowledge polls to just kind of get everybody going into the hobbyist and commercial side of this. We're going to be pushing out a poll for you to answer just like you did a minute ago during practice, and let's see what everybody says. So the first one is: a farmer purchases a UAS and utilizes it to fly over his own field, inspecting their irrigation sprinkler pivot. Do you think this is a hobbyist or commercial operation? Let me go back one.
69% said commercial.
69% of you said commercial. So in this case, that is correct. It is a commercial operation because the farmer is utilizing it to basically increase his yield on his farm there. So if he flies down that sprinkler pivot and he notices that sprinkler head is broken and it's spewing water all over the place, what's he going to do? Well, likely he's going to go out and fix that sprinkler head, therefore adjusting his yield. Although no money was ever exchanged, it is a commercial operation in the FAA's mind because he's using it for commercial purposes, and that commercial purpose would be his farm in that instance. Okay, the next one is: an individual operates a UAS to take scenic shots of mountains. The photos are then framed and hung on his or her house. Okay, the results are in on that one, and that is a unanimous 100% as a hobbyist. So there's no explanation necessary there. Everybody got that one right. True hobbyist operations there. A realtor is flying a UAS to take images of a house that will be up for sale soon. He or she does not collect the money for the actual flight, but will take commission on the house when it's sold. Hobbyist or commercial? Okay, everybody says commercial on that one, which is correct as well. So realtors do need a Part 107 certificate to operate unmanned aircraft, especially if they're going to be using those images to help sell that house. Okay, an individual is racing his or her UAS against other friends. Hobbyist or commercial? Okay, the majority of you on that one said that is a hobbyist operation. And for those that said commercial, there is a slight chance that this could end up on the commercial side. If they're professionally racing and they are being sponsored and they're getting paid to do such a thing, which is really on the far end of things, far end of the spectrum, it's possible that that could end up in a commercial operation where they're being paid to do that activity. But for the most part, in this case, we're talking about the hobbyist side of this. Okay, so there's a couple different types of unmanned aircraft system operations. The first one is model aircraft, which is your hobbyist or recreational. There's civil operations, which are commercial, and then there's public operations, which are governmental. You heard me just a minute ago talk about doing public operations here at K-State. Although those are and were a large portion of what we do, for tonight, we're just going to focus on the top two, hobbyist and commercial. For more information on public operations, please put them in the comments if you have specifics, and we'll be happy to answer those. But for the most of the people that are online, I think the top two will cover everything they need to know. So the first thing we're going to get to is the hobbyist side of this. Hobbyist regulations can be found under Public Law 112-95, Section 336. There's also advisory circular out that supplements that, 91-57A. And of course, there's a lot of good information on the FAA UAS website. So definitely use the FAA website as a source. They've done a really good job of putting all that information in one place. If any of you have been following the news here lately, there is a FAA Reauthorization Act for hobbyist operations. And I'll kind of highlight the subtle differences as we go through this, but the regulations that are in place right now are what you're seeing up here, Public Law 112-95, Section 336. However, within the next couple months, that's going to change to these new set of hobbyist regulations that are a little bit more restrictive. And so it is important to keep an eye out for publications from the FAA and news about the implementation of those new regulations. Since they're not active yet, the FAA hasn't provided a lot of information in detail, at least on what will be included in those. So there's not a lot of information I can provide you at this time. And so again, just keeping a keen eye out for publications that come out from the FAA. So under what's currently allowed to fly for hobby or recreational purposes, you're going to have to, as it states, fly only for recreational purposes. And what does that mean, really? That means that if you can fly and not receive any money, not be compensated in any way, it doesn't end up on your tax return, you know, any one of those things to where it's purely for your own enjoyment outside of work, cannot be in conjunction with your work or job at all, then you are probably going to be operating as a hobbyist. As a hobbyist, you do have to register your UAS. You have to follow a community-based set of safety guidelines, fly UAS that weigh no more than 55 pounds, fly the UAS within line of sight, give way to manned aircraft, provide prior notification to the nearest airport, if applicable, and never fly near emergency response vehicles. And we'll dive down into each one of these a little bit more. So fly for recreational purposes. The true definition is recreation or hobby use of UAS is flying for enjoyment and not for work, business purposes, or for compensation or hire. The UAS used for hobby is a pursuit outside of one's regular occupation, engaging in especially for relaxation. So essentially after work. You need to register your UAS. President Trump signed a bill reinstating the hobbyist registration. For a while there, it wasn't required. It kind of bounced back and forth. But as it states right now, you do need to register your unmanned aircraft. And to caveat that, you only need to register if it's between 0.55 pounds and 55 pounds, which does cover most of the unmanned aircraft systems out there. If it's greater than 55 pounds, likely you're still going to have to register it, but it just falls outside the purview of the registration constraints right now. So be sure to follow your community set guidelines for that. The online process costs you $5 for a registration number. And what's nice about that is that you're registering yourself, you're registering your name. And what that means is that you can take the registration number that you receive and put it on any unmanned aircraft system that you have that you're flying for hobbyists. So if you have 5 aircraft that you like flying around and having fun with, you can buy the registration for $5 and then spread that same number across all your unmanned aircraft. This is kind of different, and we'll talk about this on the commercial side. The hobbyist registration can be distributed across different platforms, but the commercial registration cannot. The other point here is that if you have a hobbyist registration, at this time, it still cannot be transferred to a commercial registration. So if you start off as a hobbyist and then you want to transition and get your Part 107 certificate, become a commercial operator, you will not be able to take that same registration and go to the commercial side. You'll need to obtain a new registration on the commercial side. Inverse of that, if you have a commercial registration, you can use it as a hobbyist. The registration must be marked on the UAS, and failure to register a UAS may result in civil or criminal penalties up to $27,000 for civil and $250,000 for criminal. There's a lot of information on the link listed below there. It shows you where and how you can comply with these requirements to register. On that site, you'll see this exact picture that you see here on how to label it. It can be engraved. You can use a permanent label, permanent marker. For us at K-State, we simply take a label maker with some good tape, Gorilla Tape, clear tape, and tape it on the aircraft. You can put it in a number of different places. You can even put it inside the aircraft if you want. It does not need to be visible from the outside. It could be in, let's say, a battery tray, but you cannot use any tools to get to that number. So if you have a battery tray that requires a screwdriver with a screw in it to remove it, then you cannot put the registration number within that compartment. For us, we see no reason to hide the number by any means. Aesthetically, as hobbyists, that may be something that you have a model that you're particularly proud of, that you built from scratch, and you don't want to ruin it by putting a label on the outside. You do have options to put it on the inside in that case. Following a community-based set of safety guidelines. This is Academy of Model Aeronautics. It's one of the largest hobbyist communities out there for hobbyist operations. And this is by no means all their guidelines, but this does highlight several of the things that they recommend. And so when it says you must follow a community-based guidelines, this is one of the companies out there that provides this to their members. You do have to become a member. I could not tell you the prices off the top of my head, but you can certainly visit their website and determine whether you want to become a member with them and operate under their purview. They do offer benefits as far as insurance and liability insurance, at least. So flying UAS that weigh no more than 55 pounds or less certified to do so. So once you're certified by your community-based organization, you'll need to register UAS via paper registration process. So as I mentioned before, the online registration process covers 0.55 pounds to 55 pounds. Above that, you're still going to make sure that you comply with all your community-based guidelines and then register your aircraft via a paper carbon copy form that you send off to the FAA down in Oklahoma City, to where they'll review your application and then grant you an IN number based off of your application. That process takes quite a bit longer than the online process. The online process is quick, probably can get it done in less than 10 minutes. And the paper process could take several weeks to even a month or so if it's a complex airframe. Hobbyist operations within visual line of sight. So what does visual line of sight mean? It means that the aircraft must remain close enough to the operator to be able to be capable of seeing the aircraft without vision, within vision unaided by any device other than corrective lenses. So simply put, you have to be able to see that unmanned aircraft and be able to, at any given time, maneuver the aircraft safely away from, let's say another manned aircraft that comes into the area. So using binoculars or strictly using the camera feed off of your unmanned aircraft will not suffice. It has to be direct visual line of sight. The operator must also operate close enough that they can maintain situational awareness in case immediate or corrective action is required. You must give way to manned aircraft and do not endanger other users of national airspace. So it is recommended that the UAS for hobby use not operate higher than 400 feet above the ground. You may have noticed that I said recommend there. Technically, as the way that the regulations are currently written, the laws rather, you can operate higher. However, when you're operating higher than 400 feet, you can pose a lot greater danger to manned air traffic, as they typically operate 500 feet and above unless they're coming in for takeoff or landing. So with the Reform Act, with the new Part 1 or the new regulations that are coming out, switching from Section 336 to Section 349, there will be a hard layer set at 400 feet within the new regulations coming out. So amongst that, there's several other things about notifying tower. One of the biggest things that I want to mention about the Reform Act is that it states a aeronautical knowledge will be required, meaning that there will be a test or an exam of some sort that all hobbyists will need to take and complete to pass and receive a certificate to fly as a hobbyist. And you may ask why they want to do this all the time. Or to get a registration or to get a license. And it really comes down to safety in the national airspace system. There's been a lot of sightings of unmanned aircraft where they shouldn't be. And where they shouldn't be, the hobbyist operator just simply might not know where they're operating, how close they're operating to manned aircraft within the national airspace system. So by taking a knowledge exam, it should help alleviate those instances where there may be conflicts within the national airspace system. So how do you currently know if you're operating in the right spot as a hobbyist without taking that knowledge exam? You can use a number of different apps. I put two of them up here right now. One is Before You Fly. It's sponsored by the FAA. It shows all their airspaces, and based on where you click on the map, or if you're physically standing where you want to fly, you can determine whether you're operating within an airspace that requires authorization or not from, let's say, the local airport. AirMap is another great source. They provide similar services to where you can go onto their app and determine the same capabilities of where you are versus where you can and cannot fly at certain locations and altitudes. One of the things that you'll see here is that hobbyists say that you're going to need to notify essentially an airport if you're operating within 5 miles of it. Under the Reform Act, because you will be taking an aeronautical knowledge test, you will be taught on airspace and how big airspaces are. So that's good and bad. The bad is that you're going to have to take the test and learn airspace. The good thing is that it'll actually allow you to operate in more locations closer to airports, on airports that are actually a little bit smaller, where previously you'd had to notify somebody. So there is advantages to this, but know that that's going to be part of the knowledge test. So I'm looking at one of the questions right now that's really relevant. So it says, I understand that the FAA Reauthorization Act canceled 336. So what are we in a state of, are we in a state of limbo for hobbyists? No, so right now we are still under the Section 336 until Section 349 comes out. Supposedly that time is going to be in July. Again, keep a keen eye out for publications from the FAA on the exact date and when that'll come out. And if the government shutdown will affect this or not, I have no idea. It may push a timeline or it may stay on track. It's just a question that I do not know right now, but we'll just have to keep an eye out for what the FAA pushes out. But as of right now, the last thing we knew is that there's going to be a lot of information pushed out on the new Section 349 and what it entails to operate underneath those new regulations. So what I recommend for now, to get as much information as you can to help aid yourself as you want to look into more hobbyist operations towards the latter part of this year, is definitely go look at what they've already published for Section 349 and compare it to Section 336. You'll see a lot of things are very, very similar, except for they've put a finite number on things, or they put a cap, here and there, to really just make it very clear and not so vague on what you can and cannot do. As far as the aeronautical test and what is going to be on it, all that's yet to come, and the areas that will be covered on that. So we're just going to have to keep looking for the FAA to publish that information. So contacting towers are often busy, and not every airport has a tower, but to find the correct number to call can be difficult in some cases. The apps that I previously mentioned, Before You Fly, and AirMap, if you go into those and you're on the hobbyist setting, in some instances they'll actually provide a number to call. So that's one way to gain access to talk to somebody to let them know that you are flying within that airspace. As a hobbyist, currently, right now, that's all you have to do is notify them that you're going to be operating there. If they don't provide the number, one way to do it is contact a number that is widely distributed and published is the airport manager number. You can call that airport manager, tell them what you're trying to do. In some instances, a smaller airport, the airport manager is all you'll need to talk to. In other cases, if it's a larger airport, then they will probably get you in contact with the tower manager or the tower the controller that's on call at that time, and you can speak with them. Again, they are quite busy, so make sure you have all your information written down before you call, as they are likely talking to manned air traffic, taking off and landing. So definitely make sure you have all your ducks in a row. So state who you are and what you want to do, conduct a hobbyist operation, provide operational area, exactly where you want to operate. That could be GPS coordinates, but again, they're in a hurry, so it might be better to give them general information, street names, if it's a smaller town, maybe a common place that most people know, and then a perimeter, within a half mile of that center location or a mile. Time of day, how long you're going to be there, how high you're going to be flying, and then of course provide a direct phone number just in case they need to get a hold of you to tell you to maybe land because they're bringing in something to land that's going to be passing right over you, or whatever the case may be. Note that if you are operating at a club or facility that's specifically made for hobbyist operations, and you have a community set of baseline guidelines and all those, then it's likely, if you're operating already within 5 miles of an airport, that they have established an agreement with the local airport to conduct operations there. As you become a member of such a club or organization, just double check with them to make sure that there's no reporting requirements and that they already have an established contract with that local airport. Never fly near emergency response efforts, large stadiums, or restricted areas. So good information on this can be found at the FAA website under the link that you see there where there's restrictions. And these often sometimes change, so as natural disasters pop up, wildfires, hurricanes, tornadoes, whatever the case may be, these restrictions come up. So there is a live place where you can go on the FAA website and look for those restrictions. And the apps that I provided, the Before You Fly, AirMap, and several other providers out there provide those same services as a live update to their maps. So you can be in there and see a red circle indicating that this is a restricted flight area due to whatever reason. One of those that a lot of people just don't pay attention to is large stadiums and sporting events. Any stadium, gathering, whatever, that has a attendance of more than 30,000 people, a temporary flight restriction goes up. That is a restriction for both manned and unmanned aircraft. The only way that you can operate in there is to obtain permission from whoever is the organizer of that event. So if you are a media company and you are there for that specific event, and you know there's going to be more than 30,000 people in attendance, and it's going to have a temporary flight restriction, just make sure you get a hold of the person that's in charge of that, so they can grant you official access into that airspace, which is not just a handshake. It is a official document. It's official documentation from the FAA stating that you're able to be there. That's filed with the FAA. Given that the FAA is the one that sets up that airspace restriction, they need to know who is all authorized to operate within it. In some instances, you may have the opportunity to help with natural disasters, given the circumstances that you may show up on scene and you have an unmanned aircraft and can provide a service, and they're willing to have you out to help them. Likely in that instance, you'll need to get put under their temporary flight restriction as well. So just make sure that you work with them to get all the documentation signed, to make sure that you are covered in case there is a problem where there's a manned aircraft in the vicinity. Okay, let's move on to the commercial side of the operations that we are allowed to conduct. Commercial regulations and information can be found under 14 CFR Part 107, FAA Advisory Circular 107-2, and of course the FAA UAS website again. So let's cover some of the highlights of the Part 107 regulations. UAS must weigh less than 55 pounds. I think there's a lot of questions coming in, but I think one of the ones I saw is whether 55 pounds includes that category. It has to be less. If you have an aircraft that weighs 55 pounds, you are not within the Part 107 regulation category. So 54.9 pounds, you're okay. 55, you're in a different class. And to operate in that other class requires you to operate on a whole different set of regulations, which are totally different in some instances than Part 107. Previously, those regulations fell under Section 333 exemptions, and I believe there's a new exemption number out there for those type of operations. But you can obtain, and we'll talk about waivers here in a minute, you can obtain waivers to operate aircraft outside the current limitations of Part 107. We'll cover that here in just a minute. Again, as the same with hobbyists, you must operate within visual line of sight with nothing to help you out other than corrective lenses. And of course, you always need to be able to have good situational awareness of that UAS to move out of the way in case you need to take immediate action. The UAS must not be flown higher than 400 feet above the ground level. You cannot operate in Class A, B, C, D, or E airspace. And for those of you that don't have a Part 107 certificate or are not a manned pilot, I know these classes of airspace probably mean nothing to you right now. And we'll talk about why it's important to get your Part 107 so you can understand these. But the main thing to know here is that there are 6 classes of airspace. The only one that's not listed up there is Class G airspace, Gulf airspace. And when you obtain your remote pilot certificate, really the only class of airspace that you can operate in without obtaining a waiver from the FAA is Class G. And you may think that's really restrictive, but Class G below 400 feet that we mentioned before makes up a very, very, very large portion of the United States. I think it's upwards of 90 plus%. I think it's like 95% even. So Class G, low altitude airspace, is a very, very large airspace. Really, the only time that these other airspaces come into play is when you're operating really close to manned airports. To operate in those airspaces, as many of you, you probably want to operate, in a city or whatever, and most cities have airports, especially larger ones. To operate within those, you do have the ability to operate within those through a couple different mechanisms. One of them, the first one, is the Low Altitude Authorization and Notification Capability, or LAANC. And that's something that's relatively new. It's been out for, I'd say, 6 or probably 8 months or so now. But essentially what it allows you to do is use an app. AirMap is one of the providers, to where you can actually go in there and select your operations area. And there's actually altitudes listed out for each airport and how high they would allow you to fly within a roughly mile by mile quadrant. By doing that, it provides you instant access to that airspace. There is some data you need to provide to the FAA when you sign up for operating in that airspace, contact information, what type of aircraft, how big it is, your RPIC information. So there is a little bit of information that you need to provide to the FAA when you select that you want to fly there. But as long as you're flying underneath the altitude specified within that quadrant or several quadrants, then you're going to get real-time access. If you want to fly higher than the altitude listed out on those locations, then you're going to need to apply for a waiver or authorization to do that operation, which is a longer process. You have to submit a form through the FAA portal online, FAAdronezone.com, and FAAdronezone.faa.gov. And through that portal, you'll be able to submit your operation that you want to conduct and basically give justification and a safety case of why you need to operate there, how you're going to operate there safely, and keep everybody else around you safe as well. So a little bit longer process, goes from near real-time access to the airspace to something that could take weeks or even months, depending on how complicated the airspace is. But you do have options there. One other note here is that not every airport has LAANC capabilities. I believe there's a little over 200 airports that still do not have LAANC because they are not contracted directly by the FAA. Hopefully within 2019, those other airports will be contracted to have LAANC as well, to where we can have this capability at every airport within the United States. But just know that not every airport currently has that capability. Small unmanned aircraft may not operate over any person not directly participating in the operation. So what you're seeing up there in the corner, operating over people, in that case would actually be illegal. To operate over people, it actually takes quite a bit of convincing and whatnot to the FAA. It's a large safety case, because if that aircraft was to come down on people in that instance, likely you were going to hurt someone. In this case, with those rotating blades, the battery and everything on board, is probably going to hit them pretty hard and can do some severe damage. So there's a lot of justification that goes into operations over people. Daylight only operations or civil twilight, 30 minutes before official sunrise to 30 minutes after official sunset local time. You can operate within those times if you have the appropriate anti-collision lighting. The appropriate lighting is a distance. You need to be able to see that anti-collision light out to no less than 3 statute miles. So if you have a light on board your aircraft that you can see out to 3 statute miles, you can operate 30 minutes after sunset and 30 minutes before sunrise. There's actually quite a few lights out on the market now that you can pick up that meet that requirement. A little bit of tape, hot glue, or Velcro, put it on the aircraft where it's visible. Likely, to some people it's counterintuitive, but you'd actually want to have that light on the top of your aircraft, because it's not so you can visually see the aircraft, it is so other manned aircraft can see the aircraft from above. So put the light up on top so they can see you operating within that area. Again, the aircraft must be registered, and just a little bit different as I was hinting to before. It is $5, but one registration per aircraft. So if like before with hobbyists, if you had 5 aircraft, you could take that same registration, put on all 5 aircraft. On the commercial side, you're going to have to buy one $5 registration for each individual aircraft you're operating. The copy of the registration must be in the RPIC's possession during flight. The registration number must be on the UAS placard, just as we said before. It could be engraved, permanent label, or permanent marker. If it's greater than 55 pounds and you're able to operate that under an authorization or a waiver, then you're going to need to register that aircraft through that same paper carbon copy process through Oklahoma City, as I mentioned on the hobbyist side. Commercial registration can be used as a hobbyist registration. I mentioned that earlier. The inverse does not work, but for a commercial registration, you can use it to operate as a hobbyist as well. Actually going to go back and point out one more thing. The document that you see at the bottom left of your screen, that is the registration certificate that you'll get once you register. That's what you'll need to make sure that you have with you every time you're flying that particular aircraft. So make sure you have the right registration. Keep a book or something where you keep all your documents in for that particular aircraft, and just make sure this is one of those documents that's in there. The registration is good for 3 years. So it does need to be, you do need to apply for a new registration every 3 years. You must yield right away to other aircraft. You may use a visual observer, but it's not required. So you can use a visual observer to help aid you. And you may think, well, if I don't need one, why would I ever want to have one? Well, the third bullet kind of alludes to that point. First person view camera does not satisfy the see and avoid requirements, but can be used as long as that requirement is satisfied other ways. So in this instance, you see the individual is flying the unmanned aircraft and has these goggles on, or first person view. So basically he's looking out the front camera that's on that unmanned aircraft. The problem here is that what he's looking through is essentially a soda straw. He's only seeing what's directly in front of him. There's not a lot of peripheral view. He can't swivel his head and see anything more. It just does not equate to the human eye. And so in this instance, what he would need is a second person standing next to him that is actually clearing the area, clearing the airspace, make sure that there's not some manned aircraft flying into the area to where there could be a potential collision. So in this case, the VO would help him so that way he could fly first person view and keep safe within the national airspace system. So there actually is quite a few more regulations, but comparative to manned regulations, there's actually not a lot. And I don't want to spend a ton of time on all these, but here's definitely some highlights for you to look over. I'll give you a minute to kind of read through these, and then I'll move on to the next slide. Okay, out of that list, one of the things that I do want to talk about is the carriage of hazardous materials. The light poly battery that most of your unmanned aircraft systems operate off of are hazardous material, but since they provide the source of power to that unmanned aircraft, you are capable of flying those. However, you cannot carry, for whatever reasons, spare batteries that are not hooked to the unmanned aircraft providing power. I have no idea why you'd want to do such a thing, but it has to be a battery on board that is supplying power to that unmanned aircraft. Another one that comes up a lot is, as far as hazardous materials, is agricultural spraying. Can you use a UAS to spray fields and whatnot? It is in some instances, a lot of those are hazardous materials, but there's some things that would not be considered hazardous. But the real problem with spraying is that there's a whole nother set of regulations, Part 137, that involves the use of an aircraft to spray. And last year, those regulations were revised to include unmanned aircraft. And you may think, oh, that's great. But actually, it's basically stating that you cannot use an unmanned aircraft for agricultural spraying unless you are 137 certified, which is a whole nother set of requirements, and you have a waiver from the FAA to have that those chemicals and whatever on board that unmanned aircraft. So it's actually quite a lengthy process to go through that. But there are individuals that have been trying to do this operation for a long time. I cannot say with certainty that they've ever made it to that point this far. I think most of them are stuck with flying water for right now, testing until they can do actual operations. Don't quote me on that. There may be one or two companies out there that in the United States that have the ability to do this now, but I do know it is a hard operation to get currently. All right, so a little bit more about the waivers and authorizations. So what we've been talking about this whole time with Part 107 is essentially, your restrictions, what you have to abide by. So what happens if you want to operate outside of those, those regulations? Well, then you need to apply for waivers or authorizations. And not everything within Part 107 can be waived. The list of things that can be waived are over there on the left in the box. Those are the items that you could go to the FAA and through that FAA portal, submit a waiver saying, how you're going to do your operation safely and why you need to do that operation for whatever purpose you're trying to achieve. This isn't a simple process. You need to provide a lot of detailed information to the FAA stating, how you're specifically going to operate, why, and most importantly, how you're safely going to do that, not only for yourself, but other users of the National Airspace System. For things like operating at night, so the second bullet down, it says daylight operation. Essentially what they're saying is 107.29 is the regulations for daylight. And in there it says that you have to operate only within daylight. But if you want to operate at night, you can go to the FAA and state that, you're going to operate at night utilizing a light that's visible out to 3 statute miles. You're going to comply with certain parts of manned regulations, so forth and so on. Night operations are the number one allowed operation that the FAA has been given waivers to. And so that one's relatively easy to obtain as the safety case is easy to justify to the FAA. Something where it's operations over people or operations beyond line of sight, those things are a lot harder to obtain as they require a lot of safety justification to the FAA. Operations beyond line of sight, operations over people, carriage of packages, those items, the Presidential Drone Pilot Initiative Program, that is within that program, we are looking at how we can conduct those operations. And a lot of those have not been defined. Although there's some of us that can do, beyond line of sight operations. All of those are limited to some extent. They aren't true beyond line of sight operations. I mean, you can't go for, hundreds of miles at a time the way that they're currently allowed. So they're very restrictive. And some of those things are a technology barrier that we just have to work through with the FAA. So just know that as you get into those, that you may be able to get a little bit wider operation than what you had before, but it may not be everything that you need. So you may have to crawl, walk, run as you go through those waivers and take what you get and then build upon it as you get more and more safety cases built into your operation. It is recommended that at least 90 days prior, submit your waivers to the FAA. If it's really complex, 90 days, they'll respond to you within that, but not necessarily give you an authorization or deny it within that time. One thing to note is pay really close attention to the instructions on how to submit those waivers and what needs to be included in them. Because if you don't, you can wait 90 days and they will deny it when they finally get to it based off an incomplete document. So pay very, very close attention to those instructions and make sure you provide everything they ask for. To operate U.S. commercially, you must obtain a remote pilot command certificate. So we've talked a lot about this, hit and miss throughout this, but to get that certificate, you must be at least 16 years old, be able to read, speak, write, and understand the English language, be in a physical and mental condition to safely operate the small unmanned aircraft system, and pass the initial aeronautical test at an FAA-approved knowledge testing center. So the last bullet is kind of the big ticket item. How do we get that approval to do it? So let's talk a little bit about that test. So you need to know and understand applicable regulations relating to UAS privileges, limitations, and flight operations. You also need to know airspace classifications and flight restrictions affecting small unmanned aircraft. The map that I provided there for you, if you've never seen an aeronautical chart, this is likely looks like gibberish to you. I mean, there's a lot of information here, and one of the hardest things about this is that this is a 2D image, but in reality, what you have to be able to interpolate is that this is a 3-dimensional airspace. So all those figures are depicted in 3D space. So you have to take a 2D image and in your mind extrapolate it to a 3D airspace image. Aviation weather, and I wish that I could say that, you know, weather.com or WeatherBug is all you need to know. Unfortunately, aviation weather is a lot more detailed. It has to be very, very precise, especially for manned air traffic, to operate safely. So what you see over there on the right in the box, the TAF, KOCK, that's actually a weather report for a particular airport in this case. And you have to be able to decode all that information and use that information to decipher what the actual conditions are. So if you don't have an instructor or somebody helping you figure out how to read that, it can be very, very cumbersome to go into a test and be able to decipher what they're actually saying within that, and then use that information to determine whether you can fly or not. You must also need to know loading and performance, so center of gravity and how that affects the unmanned aircraft, how different types of pressure in the atmosphere have effect on your aircraft performance, emergency procedures, how to contend with those, and how to react to those appropriately. Crew resource management. Often these unmanned aircraft do require a crew to operate them. There are many aircraft out there, especially on the smaller side, that it only takes one person. But as you get into more complex operations, which does include anything from 0.55 to 55 pounds, so if you get on the higher side of the larger aircraft, it may take multiple crew members to operate that. So you need to be able to work with one another to actually come up with a safe way of flying that unmanned aircraft. So a good communication, if you will, back and forth. You need to know radio communications and procedures. So you may be talking to air traffic control. You may be talking to one another back and forth, and how do you do that effectively and safely? And some other things on there, you need to be able to determine the performance of small unmanned aircraft, so how it performs on a hot day versus a cold day, physiological effects of drugs and alcohol on yourself, aeronautical decision-making and judgment, how do you make good decisions in flight, on the fly, and quickly. Airport operations, if you're operating within one of those airspaces that I said isn't inherently allowed, then you get a waiver. Well, how do you operate within those airport environments after you obtain that waiver? And then maintenance and pre-flight inspection procedures. How do you ensure that the aircraft is maintained properly and ready for every flight? And how do you, before every flight, look over the aircraft to make sure it is in an airworthy condition that allows for safe flight into the national airspace system in the same airspace as manned aircraft? Once you take that test and pass, you'll get the UAS certificate, which is the certificate you see on your screen now. It must be accompanied with a valid photo ID to prove that it is you and your name, and that certificate is associated with you. It must be easily accessible by the remote pilot during UAS operations, so likely in your pocket or in your wallet. It is valid for 2 years, and then certificate holders must pass a recurrent knowledge test every 2 years then after. So although this certificate does not expire, you're going to need to go back every 24 calendar months and retake a recurrent aeronautical knowledge review. And so what that entails is a slightly less condensed version of the initial test. Luckily for those that really struggle with weather, that's not on the recurrent test. And there's a few other sections that aren't covered. I will say that I know airspace is on there for sure. You got to retake airspace every 2 years. And so the FAA does provide a lot of information on what is covered on those tests as far as the course material. The questions themselves, they will never release, but the high-level material is listed out there on the initial and recurrent tests. One of the questions that came up is how many sections are there for the test? If you fail one section, do you retest the entire section or only the section you failed? So if you fail with, let's start over with that. You have to pass with a 70% or better. If you get anything less than a 70%, doesn't matter the section, just as a holistic view, if you get anything less than a 70%, you're going to have to retake the test. You can retake the test 14 days after you took the initial test. So within that 14 days, it allows you time to study, allows FAA to get the documentation uploaded into their system, and then you're able to retake. Once again, with the government shutdown, I have no idea how that system's working right now. I do know that you can take your remote pilot certificate test now. It is unsure to us at this time how long it takes to receive a temporary flight, certificate or the certificate in the mail. Previously, let's go back last year when the government was open, you would take the test within about 3 or 4 days. They're going to run a background check on you. And after that background check is completed, you'll get an email. And from that email, you'll get a temporary RPIC certificate. With that temporary certificate, you can operate under Part 107 until this plastic card comes in the mail, and then you rip up the paper certificate and you fly with this card for the 2 years that you have remaining. So kind of just to give you an idea of what's on the test. So here's a question, and we're not going to go through it. This is just to give you an idea of what they're talking about. So while monitoring the Cooperstown CTAF, you hear an aircraft announce that they are midfield left downwind to runway 13. Where would the aircraft be relative to the runway? We're not going to do a poll off this or anything, but there's a lot of information in here. You know, what is CTAF? What does midfield left downwind mean? What is runway 13? You know, what direction is that? How do we know which way that's orientated? How do we know where we're at? So there's a lot of information in here in this simple little, 2-line question on, how or where we're going to be at and whether that's relative to us. The next one is a weather question. So it says refer to figure 12. What are the current conditions at the Chicago Midway Airport? The figure 12 is the box listed down at the bottom, kind of a greenish tan and white. So again, it's all about deciphering the information you see down there and make it useful. So it's figuring out which one is the Chicago Midway Airport, KMDW, and then what is the actual conditions forecasted and listed out for that airport. And the last one again is these fun maps, of the United States and the airspace that lies within. This is a very cumbersome airspace, and if you want to operate in this particular area, you need to be able to extrapolate what this chart is actually telling you. Again, this is 2D image, but there is a very, very complex 3D image that you need to be able to formulate in your head to determine what airspace you're actually operating within, where you want to operate. So we do offer quite a few training courses for those that want to learn more about unmanned aircraft. The first one is a 3-day commercial remote pilot certification course. It basically is a course that prepares you to obtain that remote pilot certificate exam. I think right now we currently hold a 99% pass rate, so we feel like we're pretty good at teaching this. Myself and one of my colleagues right here teach the course. It's very comprehensive, very detailed, one-on-one instruction. You're allowed to ask questions right to the instructor. So in this type of environment where it's a lot of information compacted in 3 days, that format provides a really good way to ask questions and really understand what you need before you go into that test. The next one listed up here is a law enforcement training course. We talked about this at the beginning of this webinar. It's a 4-day course, and we do all kinds of stuff in there. It's geared towards taking law enforcement agencies that have little to no UAS experience and get them trained up on how to fly the unmanned aircraft and use it in real world situations such as fugitive, search and rescue, crime scene reconstruction. We do night operations during that. So there's a plethora of different scenarios that we throw into that course. And the other one's following that basic multi-rotor. It's a 2-day training course that gets you basically the basics that you need to start up your aircraft and get it in the air safely. Night training. Let's say that you want to fly at night, but you don't know how to fill out the waiver. You don't know what to put in the waiver to get the night training, the night waiver. During that course, we'll cover not only what you put into the waiver, but we'll also give you actual training at night. We have a night waiver, and so what better way to prepare you than to actually go out and train you at night on the required areas that the FAA has stated that it's essential that you know and understand before you fly at night. Having that information allows you to use that to turn around and put into that waiver saying you have received this training and done hands-on flight training under our instruction. Data processing, 3-day course, taking images and processing them to make 3D models or to do volumetric calculations, several other options there. 1-day introduction to LiDAR. And then we also do customizable advanced multi-rotor UAS training, depending on the situation and what you're wanting to achieve. It's a 3 to 7 day course. Some future trainings that are coming out soon, emergency management, fire department, industrial inspection, and one that's not on there is beyond visual line of sight training. So we are K-State is one of the ones that have recently received a beyond visual line of sight waiver. So we are currently allowed to operate unmanned aircraft out to extended ranges. Again, it is not 100 miles by any means. It is restricted, but we can fly beyond the remote pilot command's visual observers direct line of sight. That is huge to a lot of industries, gas line inspections, your power line inspections, large ag companies. Being able to fly at larger distances is big to them, even if it's not unrestricted. So shortly, we'll be offering a course that trains individuals on how to fly unmanned aircraft beyond line of sight, and then also help with the individual or company to obtain a waiver from the FAA using our safety mitigations that we've come up with and justified to the FAA to receive that waiver, so you can get your own waiver and do that operation that you wish to do. So some other services, we do consulting. We definitely conduct a lot of applied research for the FAA and for industry. We do a lot of commercial operations. If you need a house for, you're putting up for sale that needs to, you need to obtain pictures for, you need a field to be inspected, those type of services, we do provide those. Sensor integration. We actually have a great team of guys that can actually take just about anything and put it on an unmanned aircraft to make it work. And this technology is not uncommon that there's large sensors that are typically made for manned aircraft that individuals want to put on unmanned aircraft. And although it may not be the perfect integration, it allows to validate and prove that that technology could be used on unmanned aircraft, and then the miniaturization process then after could be applied once it's been proven out. UAS repair, if you end up in the situation where your aircraft lands and looks different than what it took off, we can certainly help with the repairs of that. And FAA test site operations, that Pan Pacific Test Range Complex allows us to do operations that are outside Part 107. We can fly up to higher altitudes. We can fly a larger aircraft. We can do a lot of the operations that are not inherently allowed under Part 107 under our test range complex to validate and prove out the technology that can then be used by the company to move on to validation of their product. For more information, you can definitely go to ksu-uas.com. A lot of great information there on our services and our training programs. And to learn more about the college and academic programs that we didn't hit a lot on, you can go to polytechnic.kstate.edu and just look for the unmanned aircraft system degrees. There's a couple degree programs. There's a minor. So there's a lot of opportunities there if you want to really make get the academic background to pursue a long-term career in this. Okay, so that concludes the hobbyist and commercial side, the 101, if you will, of this webinar. What we're going to do is take about a 5-minute break and come back and start looking at some of the questions that you have both of these people over here next to me, they've been typing quite a bit, so I know there's a lot of good questions, and so we'll definitely dive into those. This 5 minutes will give me some time to review those questions, make sure we have all the correct information for you, and we'll start going through those. So in this 5 minutes, if you have questions, go ahead and start posting them up, and when we come back, we'll go ahead and start working through those. So definitely be looking for your question to be answered. All right, everyone, we're back. So we've compiled a list of questions here that we're going to go through. So again, be listening for your question. If these questions spark other ones, just feel free to push them out there, and we'll put them up here as necessary. So the first one I have in front of me is, if I am flying indoors with a within a large warehouse, do I need to contact the control tower? No, if it is an enclosed structure, you do not need to contact the control tower. In fact, you would not even need a Part 107 license within that respect. If you're doing it as a hobbyist, even though there's no documentation requirement right now, you're pretty much completely outside the FAA's jurisdiction within that environment. So I would say that you can do whatever you want in there, but just always be mindful and be safe doing that operation. But as soon as you take that aircraft outside that covered structure, then you are within the National Airspace System. But if it is an enclosed structure, as it alludes to here, you would not need to contact the FAA in that case. Do I have to wait until I get my commercial license before registering my UAS? No, you do not. You can go ahead and register UAS at any time and get your Part 107 certificate then after. So there's no requirement to have your license before you register. It will not ask you for a certificate number or anything. So you can do that immediately. So this next question is a local question. So there's a town nearby us called Abilene, unless they are, in this case, they'll be talking about Abilene, Kansas. I'm assuming Abilene, Texas would be too big for this question. But it says, since Abilene's airport does not have control tower, do the rules still apply? Do I call anyone when I am flying? As a hobbyist, the way that it's currently written, if you are within 5 miles of a public use airport, which Abilene meets that definition, then you are going to need to call, in that case, the airport manager and notify them of your operation. So that's a simple phone call. Call the airport manager, find their phone number, call them up, and just tell them, hey, I'm so and so. I'm going to be operating at this location, this altitude. Just thought I'd let you know. Now, for your own self there, I would highly recommend that, you can certainly drive out there and talk to the person that's the airport manager. But for me as a hobbyist, if I'm operating as a hobbyist, one of the things that I would like to do is have an aviation band radio. It can be just a receive only, and get on the Abilene Airport's frequency and just listen to any air traffic that may be coming into the area. It just provides another level of safety that, maybe you're operating and you're upwind and you don't hear an air traffic coming in. Since you're in that vicinity of the airport, there may be somebody coming in to land, and therefore they're going to be low level. So being able to listen to that frequency provides you another level of safety. Now, we can dive down as deep as we wanted to here, and you would not necessarily, the individuals flying to the airport would not necessarily have to be on the radio, but from a high level, try to employ as many safety layers as you can to ensure that you're operating as safely as you can. Because if there is an incident to where there's a near mid-air collision or a collision, the investigation, of course, is going to come down on you. So be sure to employ as many safety layers as possible. How long do waivers last? So if you obtain a waiver from the FAA, it's really variable. It depends on the type of operation. You can actually state how long you need it to last. So let's say you have a particular job that you need to do. Let's say it's an inspection of some sort, and the contract is for a construction site. Well, the construction site's slotted for 6 months. Well, you can say that you don't need it for anything more than 6 months. However, there are maximums, and the FAA defines those on their portal page. But you can put out to the maximum, but that does not mean that you're going to obtain the maximum. It just depends on what the FAA deems is an acceptable level of time for you to have that waiver. So one of the ones, for instance, a night waiver. A night waiver is typically a lot longer than some of the other waivers out there, say like an airspace authorization. So a night waiver could be several years, as airspace could be less than 6 months. So definitely look at the maximum requirements if that's what you're looking to obtain, and put that in there. But just make sure you have a good safety case to justify why you need that authorization or that waiver to go out that far. The next question is, do I need insurance for my UAS? What are some of the options for that? By regulation, no, you do not need insurance, but I would recommend that you do. There's plenty of insurance companies out there now that provide services. At bare minimum, get some liability insurance. Make sure that you're covered, especially if you're a startup company, so that if an aircraft goes down and hits somebody or causes damage to a park bench even, or a car or something, you're at least covered in that instance. So having insurance is not required. One of the things that we did not cover in depth is when you have to report an incident to the FAA. So if you crash an unmanned aircraft, let's say out in the middle of a cornfield, and it does no damage to any property, but it totals your $10,000 aircraft, unmanned aircraft, that actually is not a reportable event. You do not need to report that to the FAA. The cutoff line is more than $500 to property other than the unmanned aircraft, or serious injury, which includes lacerations that require suturing, unconsciousness, and some other ones that fall into that category. But if you're ever caught in that situation without liability insurance, I don't know if you'd want to put yourself there. So make sure that you at least look into some options out there. One of the ones that's out there is a company called Verifly. Their insurance model is a little bit different. It's actually by the hour. So if you're going out maybe once a week, or a couple times every other week, then it may be a good option to purchase insurance through them. It's an online app, and you can just select where you're going to fly, and based on where you're flying, the rates vary depending on if you're operating close to an airport or critical infrastructure or whatnot. And you can purchase insurance based on just the time that you're flying, rather than a full policy that you have to pay annually or semi-annually. What brand of unmanned aircraft do you use for training? So if you've been in the industry, you would know that DJI is a very, very popular platform. A lot of the industry is utilizing their technology just because it is they dominate the market right now. So we provide training on what the industry is demanding, and right now a lot of our systems, especially on the multi-rotor side, are DJI products. So to list out a few of them, and it's depending on the course, and some of it's customizable, but we do have DJI Inspire 1s, DJI Inspire 2s, M600, M210s, Mavic Pros, and of course there's a whole sensor suite to go with those. We have everything from your standard RGB, red, green, blue visual camera, to high definition zoom cameras. Some of them are 30 times optical zoom, FLIR infrared cameras. We pretty much have the entire suite of payloads that the industry requires. So if you think about flying at night for search and rescue purposes, the FLIR camera can be a great option in that instance, to where you can pick out heat signatures and find people that may be lost in the woods or in a field or something like that. On the fixed wing side, we have a couple different types of systems. Some of them are PixHawk based, and we use a ground control station software called Mission Planner. We also have Piccolo, which are higher end systems, and those systems take quite a bit more training, but for most of our commercial offerings, and especially the BV loss training curriculum coming up, we'll stick to what's more commercially available, which would be the PixHawk system. And so you're trained on those. And then if you have a specific ground control station that you utilize, most of the trainings that we offer are all relevant to other platforms. So even though you may use a different system than what we teach, our goal is to provide you with the fundamentals necessary to take that information and apply it to your specific platform. If by happenstance you have the same platform, all the better. But it should be a universal training to where you can take what you've learned and apply it to other systems. Next question is, does the VO have to be within visual line of sight of the remote pilot, or can they use radios to communicate? The answer is yes, they can use radios to communicate. However, this is the big point here, the big key to this is that at any given point, the VO and the RPIC need to be able to see the unmanned aircraft. What you cannot do is have your RPIC be at the takeoff location, fly it out to almost the visual line of sight of the RPIC, and then have your VO position there, and then fly it out to the distance of the visual observer. Because the regulations state that both the pilot, the RPIC, and the VO have to be able to see the unmanned aircraft at all times. To do what I just mentioned about flying past the visual observer, you would need to obtain a waiver to essentially, what that's called is daisy chaining the visual observer to where you can extend that range. So it is possible to do that type of operation if that suits your operation. It is a waiverable action, but just know that if you want to operate under 107 without a waiver, you have to position your VO and your RPIC so that at all times both of them can see the unmanned aircraft. Spencer, any other questions? Okay. So I know Spencer, he's been pushing back some of the questions through the questions chat. If your question did not get answered through that forum or through anything that I just spoke to, we will take any of the questions that were not answered and put them into a transcript and provide that information to you via email. Should be about a week or so. In addition to that, the video recording of this webinar will also be provided through that mechanism. So you'll be able to go back and review this and look over what we talked about, maybe come up with new questions, and through the transcript, you'll be able to see all the question and answers that we've talked about tonight. Some of those that ended up staying on the chat side, you'll see all of those. And then again, any that we did not get to address will also end up on there as well. With that concludes the 2019 UAS 101 webinar. I appreciate all of you coming out. We had a great turnout this year, a large participant base from many states, many countries. So again, I appreciate you guys showing up and taking time out of your evening to listen to us speak. And certainly if you have any questions about what we offer and how we can help you, please do not hesitate to use those resources that we provided, ksu-uas.com. On there's a lot of contact information. Reach out to us, let us know how we can help you and get you underway with your unmanned aircraft system. Thank you again and have a great night.